We want to welcome you to our podcast, our Súnesis podcast. This time it will be in English because we have a very special guest with us.
Yeah, it is.
Her name is Amy PEELER. She comes from Wheaton College, close to Chicago. She's a professor there, and she's also a pastor in a church. So we're just really excited to have her with us. My name is Jack Vogt, and
my name is Hector Nieblas.
So we want to talk about women in the church, and but we need to have a good base from the Bible to be able to do that. And I think, like all things, you should start at the beginning, right?
Yeah, it's true.
So let's talk a little bit about Genesis 1 to 3, because I think Genesis 1 to 3 sets the stage for so much of what happens in the Bible. We can talk about creation in Genesis 1, and in your study, if you look at Genesis 1 and when humans are created, what do you see?
Yes, I mean, it is the most powerful statement in the Bible about the identity of humanity, that when God creates, humans are created in the image of God, and it's very explicit in the Hebrew that we are created male and female. That's not added in by translators as a way of being inclusive. That is at the very foundation of what's said about humanity. And that's really interesting in light of ancient Near Eastern comparisons, because in many of those stories, women are either completely ignored or they are subservient to men. And that total equality that men and women bear the image of God, and then moreover that men and women are called to steward creation, you can see no difference, no hierarchy between men and women in Genesis 1.
And Genesis 2 kind of builds on that, doesn't it? Because the humans are created, first the man, and then the animals, and then the woman. But as a helper, our thinking so often is helper is somebody that does the chores, right?
Yes.
Right.
Like an extra.
The extra stuff. But that's not the case here, is it?
Not at all. In fact, you know this well, and we have friends like Carmen Imes who have studied this, that helper in the rest of Israel's scriptures in the Old Testament is used for God. So this is a person that brings powerful help. But even within the context of Genesis 2 itself, the creation of the man, and then God showing the man all of the animals, the man realizes that God has called him to multiply and to steward, and he cannot do that alone. And so the creation of a helper means that he needed help. It really shows the inadequacy of the man. And not that the man is bad, but that God has created the man to be dependent upon another. And so when Eve is created and drawn from his side, right? And I think this is quite important, that she isn't taken from his foot, she isn't taken from his head as his superior, but as our friend John Walton has studied, from his side. And that doesn't just mean a little tiny piece, but it really is selam. It's like the cleaving in half of this being.
Wow.
Yeah. And so there is total equality. And then when the man sees the woman after he's woken from his dream sleep, right, that he says, bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. And she's presented to him as his companion, as his equal. And so some interpreters might say, well, in Genesis 2, the man comes first, and that shows some kind of superiority. But this seems a very unsupported reading to me, because the rest of the narrative says, because he's first, that doesn't mean he's better.
No.
That just means that he needs another, and he needs to be shown his need for another so that they can both do the work. He cannot multiply without her, and neither can he steward without her help.
Yeah, and I think if we look back at Genesis 1, humans are the final creation, and then they're the pinnacle. So if you take that same theory to Genesis 2, then it's the woman, not the man.
I love that. And I think actually when Paul is reflecting on the Genesis narrative in 1 Corinthians 11, he's working in that model, that the woman actually has a superior glory because she is the fulfillment of creation.
Yeah. Interesting.
In the past, I heard a preach from a pastor who has a different view. He thinks that the woman need to it's a follower of the man, and the man is more important because he is first.
He's first.
But you say I thought in the animals be first
That's
than the
right.
men. So
That's right.
that cannot be true,
Mm,
in my opinion, because
right.
if that means the first God in Genesis 2, God made the garden. So the
Yes.
garden is more important than men,
That's
so,
right.
and the animals too. So looks like we need to we need to be more deep in that
Yes.
passage and to understand better our role in
Yes.
creation.
Yeah, that's not an automatic conclusion that whoever comes first is better or superior or meant to be the leader. The man is simply first, and you can't make meaning of that that's outside of the narrative. I'd like to come back to this point, though, when we start to talk about the incarnation, because this question of who comes first is actually quite important. So I'd like to readdress that in a moment, but we have a
Okay.
lot of other texts in the Old Testament to get through first.
Yeah. So maybe there's another point we should make with Genesis 2, and I think is very important how we see women in the church today, because the Garden of Eden is created, it's temple space or
That's
sacred
right.
space,
That's right.
and the man and the woman are to take care of it and
Yes.
to cultivate it. But those are words that are used for the priest in
That's
the
exactly right.
tabernacle.
Yes.
So they're actually both there
Yes.
to serve, not that the man can serve in the
No,
tabernacle and the woman can't.
that's exactly
So it's a
right.
unit.
Yes.
And I think we miss that unity so much. We want to divide, and
Yes.
really we need to go, hey, we're a team,
Yes.
men
That's
and women
exactly
working
right.
together.
And a priestly team.
Yes,
priest-
that's
A
important.
team that is representing God and is caring for God's sacred space.
Mhm.
But then the whole
whole.
story falls.
Really quickly, actually.
Yes.
It doesn't
Very,
take much
very
time. Yes,
quickly.
yes.
And I think one of the passages that is really difficult
Yes.
is when God pronounces judgment on
That's
the man and the woman and
Yes.
the snake. And we hear the words, well, the woman will desire her husband, and it's kind of this subservient role.
Right,
There's going to be
right.
conflict.
Mm,
And so much of the time, I think we think that's normative.
right,
Yes.
right,
Mhm.
right.
But that totally undoes the story of
Yes.
what's normative in 1 and 2.
That's exactly right. Yes, and especially as people of Christian people that we live into Christ's
Mhm.
victory, why would we live under these curses? That
Mhm.
seems very nonsensical to me. But even to understand those curses, there's I think John Walton again has done such good work that this anxiety about childbearing is that it was hard to conceive, and that was something that you worried about the death of the mother or the child. I have a student who has done some very good work to say God had created men and women as this unity and this partnership, and there is a breakdown here. But that breakdown is not something that we should seek to live into. We are people of redemption, and Christ has provided a different way.
So one of the things that strikes me then about the book of Genesis and a number of stories of women in the Old Testament is how it tries to undo that
I love that.
in a patriarchal society.
Yes.
And the one I think we'd like to talk about a little bit is Hagar.
Yes.
Yes.
You know, she's an Egyptian slave. She's a nobody. Abraham and Sarah can't have children. And they never talk about Hagar by name. She's always the
Just
Egyptian
Egyptian
slave,
lady.
the
Yes.
Egyptian woman, or Sarah slave, like they can't talk to her about. But when
Looks
you
like
think...
looks like it's not like a person, right? It's
Yes.
like just like a thing.
A property.
Yeah,
Exactly.
property. And it's sad what happened with her. And then what happened with Ishmael.
Yes.
And but what do you think about that story?
I think there is so much power in how God interacts with her. God meets her in the wilderness. She names God as the God who sees, the first one to do so.
I think the only one.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And God cares for her. When she is cast out by Sarah and Abraham, when Ishmael is older, God really then allows them to flourish. Ishmael is able to have a trade as a hunter, and he meets a wife, and they actually get to return to Egypt, which is the home of their redemption. So God has freed them from their slavery because God has paid attention to their need. And so the relationship between Hagar and God is incredibly close. She's highly valued as a person in the Old Testament.
Yeah, and I think that story is maybe there to undo this patriarchal
I love
thinking.
that. Yes.
We make Abraham a hero. We've read
Yes.
Hebrews 11.
Yeah, that's right.
Abraham is a hero. He can do no wrong. But then we see this story, and all of a sudden, Hagar is faithful.
Exactly.
And if you read it, Abraham and Sarah act like
Yes.
Egyptians.
Yeah.
That's
In the
right.
future.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. There is a great reversal here of the master and the slave, and God's connection is always with the slave.
Yeah, that's true.
What strikes me is, you read the story of Genesis and you read about Ishmael and Isaac, and then you read about Esau and Jacob, and it's the younger one that carries the line and through whom Jesus will come.
Yes.
And in this story, the Hagar story is the same. It's the nobody is the blessed one, or the faithful one.
Yeah, she's faithful. And then the line of Jesus does continue through Sarah and through Isaac. And sometimes I don't like that because Sarah is just pretty awful. And so that reminds me too of grace, that Sarah does not deserve to be the mother of the covenant, and neither do I deserve. But that does in no way takes away from God's interaction with Hagar.
No.
Right? God doesn't choose a favorite and then dismiss everyone else, but God is at work in the whole world.
Yes.
And yet the covenant, the election comes through Sarah and then Jesus so that everyone can be blessed.
Yeah, and it's only possible to come through one descendant.
That's right. That's right.
Both Esau or
But at the
Ishmael
But at the same time, there is a promise.
Yes.
God's going to take care of them.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's
So
right.
that is important issue for
Exactly
Hagar
right.
and Ishmael.
Mhm.
And God is not forget them.
No, that's
No.
exactly right.
God's going to be with them.
Mhm.
And I think that is very important. And the Bible is showing us about how is God and what is God and how He relation with another people who is not part of Israel.
That's right.
Yeah.
And God is interested in them too.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, because within that story, so often we think, these people are blessed, but those ones aren't.
No.
But Genesis is full of
Yes.
righteous people that are not part of the
Exactly.
line or the covenant. And,
Yes.
and we need to pay attention that God is
Absolutely.
concerned about everybody.
That's exactly right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So when we think of these stories and then you move forward, like there's other ones we could talk about, like Tamara. She's such an interesting character and such an interesting story, and undoes so much of our thinking.
Right. Yes.
Like she has this child with Judah, and in the end Judah has to say, my daughter-in-law is righteous and I'm not.
Exactly right. And then, of course, she shows up in the genealogy of Jesus.
Absolutely, yeah.
She's there.
Or Rahab, the
Yes,
prostitute.
That's right.
Another
Yes.
one who knows what God is doing, and Israel doesn't seem to understand.
That's exactly right.
But she understands, and she's a prostitute and a Canaanite, and everything that we might think is against her, but she's this honored person.
Exactly.
Yes.
She is faithful and trusts that God will deliver her family as she worships the true God. Yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah, it strikes me that, when you look at Jesus' line, like, so there's, Hagar's not in there, and I think, like you, I'm really sorry she's
Right.
not. But I can't go back and change history.
No.
But Tamara is there, who,
Yes.
for people who don't know, Judah finds Tamara for a wife for her sons. The first two sons die,
Right.
and she's supposed to have children with them. And eventually, the only way she can have a child is to seduce
Mm.
Judah.
Mm.
And it's a hard story
Yes,
to
it
understand.
is.
But she's blessed because she's seeking life,
Right.
not death.
Yes. Yes.
And the
that's-
story is full of death, and she gives life.
I love that. Mm.
And then the story can move forward, and then you get Rahab, or you get the women at Exodus chapter 1,
Yes.
smarter than Pharaoh or
Yes.
better than Pharaoh.
Exactly.
Yeah, like when you start to look at those stories of the women, not all the women are good.
No.
No.
But when you look at so
Mm.
many of them, they just shine.
Yes. Yes. Actually, even as you say that, isn't that further proof of what we talked about with this word helper?
Yeah.
Right? If you had some kind of notion that helper means women are kind of in the background, well, you would be disavowed of that notion as you read the Old Testament, because you would see they're not just kind of, cleaning up in the kitchen. They are absolutely vital and necessary for the story to continue.
Yeah. And Ruth would be another one.
Oh, so true. Yeah.
Like when you read her story and when she goes out at night, and her mother-in-law has basically said, go get a man at night,
Yes.
put on your best dress, put on perfume,
That's right.
go uncover his feet,
Yeah.
like climb into bed with
Yes.
him. He's a little bit tipsy. Like,
Yeah.
What
I
can we
mean,
do?
it's stories that we don't want to
No.
tell our kids.
That's right.
No, that's true.
Right. Yeah.
I reject that story for my kids. I'm not share that with them.
But those stories tell us that God is concerned,
Yes.
and look at who he uses
Mhm, mhm.
and blesses them.
Yes, yeah. And that emphasis on life is really fascinating. I mean, that's so true of Ruth, that she's providing for Naomi, that she wants the line to continue. And these women take risks, and yet God honors their risk taking because they're ultimately being faithful. It does problematize our visions of what's right and what's just and what's holy. And the fact that they show up in Jesus's genealogy feels to me like a preview of who will he encounter in his ministry, those who are on the outcast of society and considered sinful, and they will see who he is. And maybe this is just always how God has worked.
It seems to be God has chosen the weak and the
Yes.
powerless,
Yes,
and then works through them
exactly.
in mighty ways.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, that's right.
So if we're thinking you're a woman, you're a teacher, you're a preacher, a pastor, more than just a preacher, but on the staff of a church,
Right.
and then you think of the New Testament. Then if we talk about Paul,
Right.
then we run into other things,
Yes,
right?
yes.
But you've done a lot of work on Mary. Maybe tell us a little bit about Mary.
Yes,
I think
Absolutely.
that would be
Absolutely.
quite interesting.
Yes. So I didn't grow up thinking much about Mary. I grew up in a church context that didn't talk much about her. I mean, of course, we thought about her at Christmas. But as I started thinking about the family of God, that God is our Father, that we are children of God, I had a friend who said to me, don't you think it matters that God chose to have a mother? I thought, well, that's a very radical statement. And in fact, God did choose this. And we see it in Paul, that when God decided to save the world, God sent forth his son. How? Born of a woman. God didn't have to save us that way, right? But God chose incarnation and chose to enter the world from a woman. And Mary is not just there to give birth to Jesus, but as you study those stories with Mary, she teaches Jesus. In the temple when he's 12, it says at the end of that narrative that Jesus submits to her and to Joseph. He's not mature enough. He's not ready to take up his work of proclaiming the kingdom. And maturity does not mean sinfulness. It just means he has room to grow. And who has God chosen to teach him? Mary and Joseph. Her Magnificat, her song of praise to God, has those themes of reversal, of God lifts up the lowly. And then that's exactly what you see in the ministry of Jesus. From where did he learn this? The scriptures? Who taught him the scriptures? Mary. Right? And so God has chosen her to influence him. And then as you move into Acts, as the Pentecost happens and the Holy Spirit falls upon the disciples, Mary is there. Acts 1:14. She's in the room praying. And then Peter says to that crowd who's gathered, You have seen today sons and daughters testifying, male and female slaves have proclaimed the good news of God. He's quoting from the prophet Joel, of course, that's right there in Joel. But in Luke's writing, the only person that is ever called a female slave of God is Mary.
Wow.
And so I think he's being very clear in his writings of the Gospel of Luke and Acts that Mary is preaching at Pentecost. And who else would you want preaching at Pentecost than the one who had known him since the moment he was conceived? And so for me, I grew up in a context that there were lots of debates about the writings of Paul, and we can have those conversations, and we should. But I had a teacher who said, when there's a debate, ask a different question. And for me, Mary has been a way of asking a different question. That at the very base of our faith, we cannot even say Jesus is Lord without assuming her. Because how do we get Jesus, who is a human who walks among us? God chose Mary. And so that has been the non-negotiable, the definitive statement of God's valuing of women, is that God chose her not only to give birth to Jesus, to provide his flesh, but to teach him, to influence him in his ministry, think the wedding of Cana, and then to proclaim his good news. And if God thought women were worthy to influence the Son of God and proclaim his teaching, I think that becomes our example for what God wants to do with all women.
What I find really interesting about Mary as well is when they go to find Jesus in the temple and then they return, it's Mary. It's
That's
not
right.
Mary and Joseph.
That's right. That's right. Because later on, we don't hear anything about
Joseph is gone.
He's probably died. And she continues to be present in Jesus's ministry. That's exactly right.
And even when you think of the 12 disciples that Jesus calls,
that's right,
or the apostles, I think it's the chapter before, after, where there's this large group of women that follow Jesus.
That's right. Luke 8, yes, mentioned again at the end of Matthew and Mark. That's right. I've actually said before to my students that I'm very grateful that the 12 apostles are men, because that, I think, balances things out, because Mary of Nazareth's influence is so magnificent in the life of Christ and in salvation. And then, of course, who is the first person to see him raised from the dead? Mary Magdalene. And so actually, if the disciples were like 6 men and 6 women, and then we had these 2 giants at the beginning and end of Jesus's life, Mary and Mary, we might say that our religion is kind of leans in the direction of women. But because we have Mary and the 12 apostles, it all balances out. Just like we saw in creation.
Yeah, exactly. I think Luke is looking at Genesis 1 and 2.
Oh, without a doubt.
When he's writing his gospel and the book of Acts as well. He's very, very careful to balance this women and men.
That's right.
Because if there's a child raised, if there's a female child raised, then there's a man raised.
That's right. That's
in both Luke and Acts.
That's exactly right.
Like he's just very careful to bring that balance between genders and.
I think Luke is trying to present the gospel is for everyone.
Yes, that's exactly
so it's
right.
not, we'll have preference. Like some of them thought in that time, we are Israelites, we are the people of God, we are best than the other.
Yes.
So I think Luke is trying to present a gospel for everyone, like Genesis. It's God blessing everyone around the world, and I think Luke is trying to present the same idea.
Right.
So it's very interesting how sometimes we, like Christians today, we try to include in the word could be take a position, an extreme position, and we disbalance is the word. We disbalance the ideas, but God is trying to present something and give us a message. We have a important word to present Jesus to everyone and the gospel for them. And I think Luke is very clear in that.
Yes.
And when we teach about the apostles or something or about Jesus, we need to take care to not do that or present preference in the church. And I think it's very important. In a Latin American culture, I think that is an important issue. And sometimes we forget that.
And Luke does such a good job of that balance between the wealthy and the poor, between Jews and Gentiles, and certainly between men and women. I wonder if I might say very quickly, because I do think Luke is attentive to the creation narrative. I'm going to come back to that point about who's first. So it is true that in Genesis 2, that first human being is a man, and then from the man, the woman is drawn. And so you kind of have a male preference, and we talked about, or at least a male chronological priority. And we talked about, well, what do you do with that? But it is really fascinating to me that in the incarnation, it moves in the opposite direction. Because right, it's the Luke and Matthew are very clear that Joseph is very kind and he helps Mary and protects Jesus, but he is not Jesus's dad. Right? That is absolutely clear. This is virginal conception. And so do you not have the complement to the picture that you see in Genesis? A man, and from the man, a woman is drawn. And then in the incarnation, a woman, and from her flesh, the male savior is drawn. So if I have friends or colleagues who believe in male headship or leadership or priority because of Genesis, I'll say, okay, I'll go with you. There's male priority there. But that's not the end of the story. For in the incarnation, there is female priority. Only a woman is the one from whom the Savior is drawn. And so again, you have balance. Male, female, then female, male. And there we have the picture of the image of God, which is male and female from Genesis. So I will grant that male priority because then I get the balance in the incarnation. And who can disagree with that unless you don't want to affirm virginal conception, which I don't think that you want to go against the Bible.
No, that's a good argument. Yeah. When I started on this route, just a little bit of personal testimony, I read a paper that a guy, his name is Arvin Thiessen, he's put into a book.
Yes.
And it was in the manuscript style when I read it. My sister was his secretary, so I got to read it. And what made me realize this was his work on Genesis 1 and 2. And just exactly like this, we're equal.
Yes.
We're made in God's image as a pair to work together.
Yes.
And that made me rethink so much of this other male headship and all of this. Like it started a process. It was a long process, but it started it. And then one day I got to preach on I forget the passage. I think it's Luke 8 about the sinful woman.
Yes. John 8.
John 8. And she anoints Jesus' feet.
Oh, that's Luke 11. Okay,
Luke 11. There we go. I had it written down someplace, but I
wasn't the gospel.
Yes.
Okay, so good. You know your Bible.
I think that's right. It happens in several places. So.
Yeah, but I think it's Luke.
It's Luke 7, I just remembered.
Yeah, Luke 7. That sounds right. She comes and anoints her feet, and most people will say she's a prostitute.
Right.
Because she's a sinful woman. She's a sinner. So it has to be a prostitute if it's a woman, right?
Right.
But just before that, Jesus has been together with the tax collectors and sinners.
Yes.
So tax collectors are sinners.
Exactly.
So when it's the men, we think, no, we have no idea that this is sexual.
Right.
But as soon as you put it on a woman, you think it's sexual.
Yes, that's true.
My sermon was that she's just a sinner.
Yes.
Could be a tax collector. Could be a poor person. Could be whatever. But we have no indication that she's actual a prostitute.
Right.
None. That's a read-in.
Yes.
And a girl came up to me afterwards in church and said, "Thank you so much for saying that. That's freeing."
Wow.
So that idea of you're a bad person and you're worse because you're a woman.
Right.
It had nothing to do with being what she was doing, but the idea you're a woman, you're single, maybe you go to a party sometime, maybe you do some other things that we don't know about. We're not controlling your life, like you're living by yourself. And immediately you get the wrong idea.
Yes. Wow.
And that kind of reinforced my thinking. I need to go back and do a study and...
Well, think about the story you learned, right?
Rethink them.
Yes.
And eventually you end up in Paul, right?
Yes, that's right. That's right. All roads lead to Paul. Yes.
All roads. And I think it's actually very unfortunate.
Yeah.
I mean, Paul has been studied to almost to death, right?
Yes, that's correct. That's correct.
If you want, you can find so much on Paul, but you don't find that on the Old Testament or necessarily the Book of Acts or whatever.
Right.
But the focus is Paul.
Right. And that's, I mean, if we're telling kind of personal stories, and I'm grateful to God having led me in this way, but that's why I started my writing with Mary. I didn't maybe know that but it just felt like I've got to start in a different place. And then I will get to Paul, but I've reshaped the conversation, I think, because I've not given him the first attention. Because then we just get into, what do you say about these texts? And that's important, but I think we need to ask like a deeper question. Like, what does Genesis say? What do we see about the women in the Old Testament? Because Paul didn't fall out of the sky.
No.
He is meant to be read in the whole of the Bible.
That's true.
Yeah. And I think that's a very important thing. Like, he's part of it, but
right.
he's not the end. Because
No.
even in the New Testament, Luke has written more than
That's
Paul.
right. That's exactly right. Yes. And they were friends. And I actually, as I've pressed into these texts of Paul, I've come to the conclusion that they're actually some of the most honoring texts for women. Now, I know that is a hard bill to sell, but that is how I read them now.
And I would agree with you
Mm-hmm.
that they really seek to undo that culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
right.
a radical change in that culture, what Paul is
Yes.
trying to do.
That's right.
And instead, we see him as being oppressive.
That's right. Yes. Yes. But I was very blessed to have a teacher, a woman who studies Paul, who just said, I love Paul, and let's think about his big themes. And it's not about performance and earning people's accolades, but it's grace. And then she taught us ways of reading these passages. I was very glad that early on I wasn't said, oh, you should hate Paul. If you're a woman, you should hate Paul and stay away from him. No, I was taught to see him as a friend. And I've discovered more ways to do so, but I'm glad that's where I began.
You want to share some of those ways?
Absolutely.
Please.
Which passage should we begin with?
Well, I think we should maybe just talk a little bit about how Paul's letters are written.
Sure.
Like Galatians is first, if I understand.
That's right. That does seem to be correct that he starts
And
there.
in there, he says the dividing wall is broken. There's
Yes.
neither female nor slave,
Yes.
or neither female nor male, nor
Nor
free,
slave.
nor slave,
Yeah.
nor Jew, nor Gentile.
Right.
We're all
We're all in Christ. Yes.
Yeah, we're all in this together
Yes.
in the same way.
Yes. Yes.
And then he writes Romans somewhere, or no, it would be 1st and 2nd Corinthians next.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this passage about women being silent and head
Right.
coverings and all of that. And then he writes Romans, and
Yes.
N.T. Wright says, you need to start in Romans 16 if you
That's
want
right.
to talk about
That's
the ball.
exactly right. That's exactly right. Yes.
And,
Yes.
and as you look at it, if you think of the Corinthians passage, Galatians, everybody is the same.
Yes.
Corinthians, you could read it as
That's
a
right.
hierarchy. You
That's
could.
right. Mm-hmm.
And then you come to Romans at the end of Romans, and you have to say, no,
Right.
what happened in
Yes.
Corinthians, right?
That's right. That's
So we
right.
need to reassess Corinthians.
I love that. Yes. So our challenge with Paul is not a modern issue, right? It's not as if the feminist movement has been birthed and therefore we want to read Paul. The issue with Paul is internal coherence. Either Paul is speaking out of two sides of his mouth,
Absolutely.
or you have to read him as a thoughtful and consistent human being. And therefore, everyone has some challenge. That's actually something I appreciate about this conversation, is that if you are with an interlocutor that is a person of good faith, they will recognize that this is hard to make sense of Paul. Because on an initial kind of easy reading, he sounds like he's pro-women and then anti-women. So everybody has to do the work of how do we make this person consistent?
Yeah.
It's about making scripture make sense, not about responding to some kind of modern questions.
Yeah. And I think that's a very important habit to make wherever we're reading.
That's right. That's right. Yes.
And we need to read within their cultural
Mhm.
context. We need to read within the culture of the Bible,
Yes.
like the whole Bible.
Mhm.
How does this fit?
Yes.
Or if it doesn't fit, then what have we got?
Exactly. So maybe we should say a word or two about those passages in Corinthians. Would that be helpful?
Sure.
Yeah, the statements that women should be, it's shameful for a woman to speak in church. It's good for listeners to know, of course, that in the manuscripts, and right, there are over 5,000 manuscripts of the New Testament, and because people were copying by hand, there's lots of variance there. I totally trust that what we have is what God wanted us to have. But this is a place where the manuscripts disagree with one another. So these verses are sometimes after verse 33 and sometimes after verse 40. And so what that says to those who study how the manuscripts were made, textual critics, is that this could have been added in. So it could have been a marginal note. Scribes wrote all kinds of stuff in the margins.
Yeah.
It's really fun.
I heard that somebody wrote, "This is boring."
Exactly. Yes, they're very colorful in their comments. So this could have slipped in. But, we don't have any manuscripts yet that have been discovered where it's absent. So say the ending of the Gospel of Mark has all the kind of stuff about snakes and things. That's not present in lots of manuscripts, but these verses are. So, okay, they're around. Another option is that Paul could be quoting from the Corinthians. Something about manuscripts is that it has no punctuation. And so if you are going to quote from someone, you have no way to communicate that in Greek in the first century. And we know that Paul is quoting from them because in several places he'll say, concerning that which you wrote, ... Right? And we know that he's like quoting from them. So that's an option as well, that when he has these wild statements that, well, I think they're wild, but these statements that seem at odds with other things he says, then it might be that he's quoting from some of the Corinthians who want women to be quiet, and then he says, did the word of God go out from you only? Like, who gave you control?
Yeah.
And the reason why, I have to admit, Jack and Hector, I had resisted that option for many years because, he doesn't have the phrase concerning that which you wrote. But he does say that women should be silent as the law also says.
Exactly.
Do you want to say something about that?
You can't find that law.
No.
It's nowhere in the Bible.
There is nowhere in Israel's scriptures that say women should be silent. Nor is this how Paul tends to talk about the law. Either he talks about the law as God's gift, or he'll cite a specific place. So I eventually have been persuaded that Paul would just not say this. And so maybe this is a quote. As some other people will say that the issue is what kind of silence is Paul urging here? Because earlier he's told the prophets that they have to be silent and take turns speaking. So maybe the women are speaking in such a way that they're interrupting or making it hard to hear. But what we know for a fact is that 1 Corinthians 14 cannot mean that women have to keep their mouths quiet in church.
Okay.
Because in 1 Corinthians 11:5, Paul says very clearly that women are praying and prophesying. You cannot prophesy silently.
No.
And so again, we've got to figure out what's going on, but without question, Paul is not telling women to be quiet. They are prophesying in church. And so that makes me say, well, in 1 Corinthians 14, I've got to figure out a way to make sense of what he said in 11.
Yeah.
And could I say, I don't think it can go the opposite way. You can't say, well, Paul says women should be silent, and so they can't be prophesying. I just cannot think of a way in which you could. He says they're prophesying in church, and it's not even a big deal. He's talking about head coverings. He's just like, hey, when women pray and prophesy. So I don't think it can work in the opposite direction, that you try to say that women aren't really prophesying in the church. Even the most conservative or those who would believe in male leadership acknowledge that women are saying something in the gathering of believers.
And when we think of prophesying, like we might think, oh, somebody goes in a trance and that's not the idea.
There is a normal view here. So
Oh,
most people,
interesting.
yes.
Interesting. Okay.
But prophesying is preaching.
That's right. That's right. Prophesying is reflecting on what God has said in the scriptures and applying those scriptures to the community. Sounds like preaching.
Good.
Yeah, so they're preaching in 11.
Yeah.
It's 11. And in 14, they're told to be quiet.
Right.
So-
and maybe that just means they need to take turns, right?
Yeah,
Because this whole
exactly.
section is about having orderly worship, that you can't all jabber at the same time. And so just as he said to the prophets and those speaking in tongues and those interpreting, you got to take turns. Maybe that's what he's saying to the women. But I'm more in the line of, I think he's quoting from some just angry guys. And then he
Yeah.
tells them, the word of God did not just go out from you.
Yeah, and I think the idea of this law is actually a Roman or a Greek
That's
law.
right. That's exactly right.
So
Yes.
he's using a cultural law to
yes.
say that the law says
Yes,
you can't speak here, but then he's given them permission to prophesy.
exactly.
So that law does not apply.
That law does not apply to believers. No. Yes. 1 Corinthians 11 then? Or should we move to 1 Timothy 2?
You know, before we move to 1 Timothy 2, Romans is
Oh,
in
of
there.
course. Yes,
Yes.
thank you.
We
exactly.
should talk about Romans.
That's
I think we
exactly
should
right.
talk about Romans 16.
Yes.
Because Hector has some
I-
questions about
I'm
love
interested
it.
in some ideas about this chapter because interesting, the most people are okay, you have two kinds of people. You have men, you have women, but the most people are women
Mhm.
when I count them.
Mm.
But there is important two person. There is one is a person whose name in Spanish is Junias,
Uh-huh.
and the other is a Crosinio. I think is the name, but it's interesting for me.
Andronicus. Junior and Andronicus.
Andronicus
Uh-huh.
and Junius. But what do you think about them?
Yes. Yeah, in verse 7, this pair is mentioned, and they are fellow family members with Paul, and they were Christians before Paul,
Yes.
and they were preaching the gospel so boldly that they were imprisoned. And finally, it says that they are esteemed among the apostles. We'll
Yeah.
come back to that in a moment. So the first thing is about the names. So this name in Greek is in the accusative case. Okay, so just 1 minute on grammar.
Okay,
let's
So
do some grammar.
let's do some grammar. So when you have a verb like I throw the ball, throw is the verb and the ball is the direct object, right?
Okay.
In Greek, that's in the case called an accusative. And in Greek, if depending on what case you're in, you kind of have some different letters. So when this name is in the accusative, it has an N at the end, and therefore it's not immediately clear if that is a masculine or a feminine noun.
Okay.
Spanish does much better with this than English does because we don't have gendered nouns, and so this is much better. But, and so early on in the translation and interpretation of Romans, like all of the church fathers assumed and believed this to be a woman, Junia. That changes like in the early Middle Ages, and they assume that this maybe is a man. But here's the thing, culturally and archaeology and the text of the first century. If you look at inscriptions and manuscripts, do you know how many times you have the name of a man, Junius? You want to guess? Zero. None. None at all. And so it is abundantly clear that this is a woman. Even the most conservative people who believe in male leadership have agreed, okay, this person is a female. So they're probably a husband and wife or maybe a brother or sister. That is without question. So if your translation says, well, maybe this is a man or has a male name, your translation is 100% wrong. And if you buy a newer translation, it will be changed. I usually don't speak so boldly, but there is no question about this whatsoever. She is female. Now, the question comes in the latter part, is she esteemed as one of the apostles or is she esteemed by the apostles? And it hinges on a Greek preposition that truly could mean either thing. So I don't think that we can prove definitively if it's one or the other. What we can prove is that she is so boldly preaching the gospel that she ends up in prison. And they often didn't put women in prison.
Yeah.
And so is she an apostle or not? I don't think that we can fight that battle. I don't think we can know for sure from the grammar, but many in the early church considered her an apostle. And even if she's not an apostle, she's preaching. And she's being bold with the gospel. So that's what we learn from the life of Junia. Men and women are empowered by the Holy Spirit to preach, and maybe will get themselves in trouble for doing so.
I read the comments from John Chrysostomos.
Yeah, exactly.
And he said she is part of the 70 apostles who Jesus sent.
Yeah, that's really important because as you study the New Testament, I kind of grew up thinking if I see the word apostle, that means the 12. That is not at all true. As you read the Gospels, a wide group of people are called disciples and apostles. And when the Gospel writers want to talk about the 12 men, they say the 12. But when they say apostle or disciple, it's a much broader group of the 70, of the women who are traveling, the women who are at the cross. The wider group is made of men and women, without question. And then, of course, Paul himself says, I'm an apostle, right? And so he experienced Jesus. And so maybe that includes people who saw the resurrected Christ as well, those 500 who saw him in between the resurrection and the ascension. So it's a much bigger group.
Wow. And there is another person that I really like the way Paul presents her. He is the mother of Rufus. Yes. He says she is like a mom for me.
I love that.
And she represents something. I think she represents something for Paul, very special for relationship with Paul. But at the same time, I don't know if she has a relationship like a leadership in the Roman Church, because when I talk in a spiritual mom,
yes.
I think in a person who can advise me and give me some reference how to handle my life.
Yes.
And when I read Paul saying that, it's interesting how, for me, it looks like an old of the church. So what do you think about her? Because I read in the gospel just the man who helped Jesus with the cross.
Yes.
Is the father of Rufus and Alexander.
Yes.
Alexander, I think
that's so. That's right, yeah.
So I don't know if it's exactly the same Rufus.
That's so interesting.
But if he is the Rufus that the gospel said, maybe has a really connection with Jesus and a good disciple of him.
Wow.
But I don't know what do you think about that comment of him? And what do you think about that possibility to be a disciple and wife of the man who helped Jesus to cross?
I've not heard that, but that is fascinating. And I think the person who might do some research on that is Richard Bauckham. Has a book called Gospel Women, and he's also done a lot of work with names in the New Testament and drawing possible connections with people. So that is a fascinating idea, and that would be my first place to go and check that out. But I do think it says that Paul is very willing to be influenced by women. And I think my understanding of Latin culture is that you have a beautiful sense of family, even of mothers who are spiritually influential in ways that maybe is diminished in Anglo culture. So I think I can learn a lot from what this looks like. And Paul himself is opening himself up to this influence. It makes me think too of when he praises Lois and Eunice, who are the mother and grandmother of Timothy, as the women who have preached the gospel to Timothy, explicated the scriptures to Timothy, and really caused him to be the young leader that he's become. It's their influence. So Paul also sees himself as a co-worker with these influential mothers and grandmothers.
And that is the same line that he used in Romans 16.
Exactly.
Co-workers.
Exactly.
To
That's
man
right.
and women.
That's exactly right.
And the other woman that's so prominent in Romans 16 is Phoebe.
Yes.
Exactly. And it's hard. This is a place where understanding the context is so important, because when we read about her at the beginning, we're like, oh, she seems nice. She's called a benefactor of Paul. And so that probably means she was a woman of some kind of wealth and would have supported him. And she's also called a deacon, and it's not a deaconess. She's the same title as the office described in 1 Timothy and Titus. And most importantly, by mentioning her here at the beginning of the epistolary greetings, the letter greetings, this indicates that she's the one that Paul handed the letter to. She would be the letter carrier.
And that would mean that she would read it when she gets to Rome,
You know,
probably.
Probably so. I did a little work on this fairly recently, and there's an ongoing conversation that maybe she read it. It could also be that, and of course, you know, there are multiple churches in Rome, not just one. It could be someone in the church read it. But here's what we know for sure about letter carriers and what Paul says about her. Receive her, give her honor. As they're reading Romans, and probably she read it, but even if she didn't, if they have questions, and you know, people have had some questions about Romans throughout the centuries, then the person who is there to represent Paul and answer the questions is Phoebe. If Paul thought that women were not capable of teaching theology, he would not have handed his most theological letter to a woman. This to me is also just, I don't see how you argue with this. And again, many of our friends would say, well, yes, women can teach and, you know, preach and do theology, but they have some questions about authority, and maybe that would take us into other places.
Yeah, we should talk about that.
Sure.
And you've said some of these passages are the most, I'm not quite sure your word, liberating or...
Yeah.
Yeah.
And really in my tradition growing up, the text that gets talked about the most is 1 Timothy 2:11 through 15.
Yeah.
I have a colleague who calls it the one ring to rule them all. And I want to be fair here to friends that would believe in male leadership. They would say, well, I read the creation narrative different, and I see that male are priest and male king. So there's more arguments, right?
Yeah.
But in my research, and I've tried to read as widely as possible, it is absolutely the case that whatever argument is happening traces itself back to 1 Timothy 2 in Protestant scholarship. In Catholic scholarship, it goes back to 1 Corinthians 11, so that's a different conversation. But Protestants base their understanding of gender on 1 Timothy 2, and I can chapter and verse that for you and show you all the receipts. It's absolutely the case. So what's going on here? So 1 Timothy 2, starting in verse 11, well, maybe starting in verse 8, it's important to recognize that this is the setting of a church, and Paul is talking about how do we conduct ourselves in worship. And he says initially, hey, I want to make sure, men, that you're not praying with anger.
Yeah.
Now, I think that's very interesting because I have not heard an interpretation that would say, you know, all men struggle with anger because Paul says this, right? That doesn't, at least in my context, hasn't gotten applied widely.
Yeah, and we probably don't talk about that, period.
We probably don't talk about that verse much at all. That's well said. And
because there's an important part in these verses that we want to talk about.
Yeah, that's right. That is a good point. We skip forward. But I certainly wouldn't want to say that all men are angry. I know that to be not true. So anyhow, but there's some men who are angry in this church, and Paul is warning them that they need to be careful.
It sounds like there's a lot of conflict going on.
There's a lot of conflict in this church. That's exactly right. That's totally correct. And it's not just gendered conflict. In verse 9 and 10, Paul warns the women about how they dress, that they shouldn't be in fancy clothes and hair braided in gold. Well, automatically we realize that he's not talking to all women, but to some women, that the slave women can't get gold jewelry. And so this is a class issue. So maybe some men are mad and some women are conducting themselves in which they're kind of flaunting their wealth. So right away, we might say, you know, Paul is not talking to all people in this text, but to a particular group. He goes on to say that he does want women to learn, and that's important. Not every woman in the ancient world got to learn, but Paul says women should be educated. And he says that when they learn, they should have a demeanor of quietness and be submissive. I don't think that's a terrible thing, because when we learn, we're quiet, right? That's just a good posture. I don't know everything. I want to learn. The hard part comes in verse 12. Paul says, I do not allow a woman to teach nor to have authority over a man, but she should be in the state of quietness. We should begin by recognizing that the word for authority here
that's very important.
is very important. And it is a word that is not repeated anywhere else in the New Testament, nor in the Greek translation of Israel's scriptures, nowhere else. So normally, how do we understand the words in the Bible? We do a word study. We cannot do a word study with this word. And if we look at the wider context of the Greco-Roman world, we see that very often this word has a negative connotation, that it means not just have authority generally, but to usurp or be like a dictator or take over. So in some ways, this passage could be very easy to understand if we say, Paul's probably talking to rich women who think they're better than everybody else. They're trying to take over. And he says, I do not allow women to act this way. He would also say, men, you can't act this way, right? When he tells others how to conduct themselves as leader, they need to be humble and gentle. So it could be that there are some women that Paul says not to do this, and this is kind of a particular cultural issue in this place. And if I wanted to make my life easy, I would just adopt that and say, let's keep going. I'm going to take just a few more minutes here. And if we need to cut this, that's fine. But the challenge comes then that Paul's reason for saying women can't teach and have authority goes back to creation. For Adam was created first and then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but Eve being deceived became a transgressor. So my friends who would believe in male leadership would say, this is not just about rich women, and it's not just about, being a bad kind of authority. Paul is basing this in creation, that the man came first and that the woman was deceived. Now, the tricky thing about this verse is that if you just read it on a surface level, it sounds like Paul is saying, hey, women, you cannot teach or to have authority. You can't preach or be the pastor, because that's not how creation worked. The man came first and then the woman. And even more, the man wasn't deceived, but the woman was deceived. If you look at interpretations, say, before 1960, most interpreters will say, oh, that's exactly right. You know why women can't preach or be pastors? Because they're more sinful. Women are more easily deceived and will fall into sin. What's that?
Paul saying.
Right. I mean, and that is the most literal black and white reading of this passage. And we find ourselves in a time period, and I'm grateful for this, that most person that is civil and kind of normal doesn't want to say that, right? Nobody wants to say women are more sinful. But you need to recognize that that is what most Christian interpreters said for millennia. Now, they knew that their mom was real nice and they liked their sister, but they just had this idea that women are more sinful. And that's what the text seems to say. So my friends who believe in male leadership and say, well, this is based in creation, I think they have to have an answer for how they understand this note about women's deception. I have often said that if 1 Timothy 2 stopped at verse 14, then I might have to change my life. Or I might have to not been a teacher and not been a pastor. And here's the other thing. There's no wiggle room here. If you adopt this position that creation shows us that women cannot teach or lead, then you really can't say, hey, but women can teach or preach in a church, but they can't be the authority. It's not clear to me that that's there. It's the whole enchilada. It's either women can do everything or this seems to say women can do nothing. And so if it stopped at verse 14, I would do nothing. I don't know, maybe I'd go and just run all the time. I have no idea, but I wouldn't do what I do with my life. But it does not stop at verse 14. Paul goes on to say, the deception is not the last word in this passage. Salvation is. So he goes on to say, but a woman will be saved. So here's what I think he's doing. I think that there are some rich women who are trying to take over. I think there are some men that are mad at those rich women. And I think he says, hey, women, I don't want you to teach and I don't want you to take over. And you know why? Because creation, a man came first. And in creation, a woman was deceived. Maybe he's saying to those women, you've gotten on your high horse and you think you're better. You need to remember that in creation, a woman came second and you're open to being deceived. But imagine how this would play out in the community. These men who are already mad at these women, and then Paul says, women, I don't want you to teach or lead because the man was first and the woman fell into sin. These guys would be like, oh, Paul, that is exactly right. Those women, second in creation and first in sin. Preach it, brother, and tell them to sit down. But this is a rhetorical move that Paul makes in other places. Sometimes he will state very basic things that are true, right? This is a reading of Genesis 1 through 3, or 2 through 3, right? Adam was first and then Eve. But he makes statements in such a way to fan the flame of a portion of his audience only to flip the idea on his head. Best example, Romans 1. He has this catalog of Gentile sin. You know all the terrible things Gentiles do? They're idolaters, and they're angry, and they mistreat their bodies, and they have sex, men with men and women with men, and those dirty Gentiles. And then what does he do in 2:1? Oh, you Jewish people, if you're thinking, oh, how bad those Gentiles are, boom, you are without excuse, you who judge. Right? All those things are true. Those are sins. But he said it in such a way to get his Jewish audience going and going and going. And then he says, you also are condemned because you're judging. I think he's doing exactly this here. To those men who are angry, who say, oh yeah, women second in creation and first in sin. Paul says, oh, you think women should sit down and shut up all of the time? How did God save the world? She will be saved. How? Through the bearing of a child. And this is not like women get saved as they stay home and take care of babies. The Greek here is the having of a child. And it's articular. It's a singular event. How does salvation happen? Through Jesus. Right? I mean, this is just basic gospel. Women are caught in transgression and then they get saved. How do they get saved? Through Jesus. But he's very particular that they get saved in the way that God chose to save the world by Jesus coming through a woman. This flips the whole thing on its head. So if those men thought, oh, women are second in creation and first in sin, well, yeah, maybe that's what happened with Eve, but what happened in the incarnation? Women were first and influenced Jesus by faithful righteousness. Mary redeems Eve in this very passage, so that Paul can go on to say then, women who are saved by Jesus, the one who came from a woman, have the opportunity to grow in faith and love and sanctification and self-control. And so he ends by saying, basically, he invites the men to reconsider what he said above. And here's my final statement. I think then once they've kind of been flipped over and they have to consider the incarnation, they might need to go back and reconsider what he said in verse 12. We often hear it as it focused on the prohibition. I do not allow a woman to teach or have authority. But what if the emphasis is on a different syllable? What if the emphasis is not on the prohibition, but on the I? Here's what I think might be going on. I think Paul is saying, I don't allow a woman to teach or to have authority. You know how much I appreciate Junia? You know how I've lifted up Phoebe? You men who are mad at women might think I'm going against male leadership. But you know whose lead I'm following? It's not me who's allowed women to teach or to lead. It's God. Because it's God who called a woman to bring the Savior into the world. It's God who put the Spirit upon men and women. And if you don't like it, you can take it up with God.
Yeah.
That's how I've come to read 1 Timothy 2.
Thank you. Very, very good. And just to close, for further material, you're writing a book on Mary.
Well, it's a little bit more on Paul this time. This is the book on Mary. But this time I simply am asking the question, as I've done here, are there places that Paul refers to the incarnation that maybe we haven't seen?
Yeah. So I'm looking forward to reading.
And I'm looking forward to finishing it.
Or you can read my book as
That's
well.
exactly right. Yes, which is very good.
Yeah, and I've tried to deal with some of those and approach it from Genesis to the end of Paul. Right?
Yes.
And maybe people won't change their mind.
That's fine.
But we'll still love them.
Absolutely. And we want people to have their own conscience. And they shouldn't buy our word for it. No. They've got to do the work themselves.
Yeah,
they need to study like these women.
That's right. That's right.
But to be honest in our study, I think that's very important.
Yeah.
be open to reading new ways and listening to other people. I think that's just so important to build our understanding of the Bible and what God wants.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for the
with us.
conversation.
Yeah.
You help a lot with your teaching.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we're just grateful for this time together, and we're looking forward to more conversations.
Yes.
Maybe they'll be over the distance, or maybe you can come back to Edinburgh.
That would be
sometime.
lovely. That would be lovely.
Yeah, we have grown to appreciate your teaching very much. Thank you so much.
It's been a joy to be here.